Now, one of the main important top things to remember when it comes to this type of legislation is that only a few years ago, it was pretty much taboo to voice any type of questions or critique of policies such as BEE or any other related race-based policies. The needle has very clearly shifted to a point where open criticism and open debate regarding the morality and effectiveness of these policies has become appropriate and very much accepted in the public discourse. And it is within that context that this conference takes place. Because at some point we have to start asking not only the important questions, but also start stating, but what does the future look like? So since the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, approximately 313 pieces of racial legislation have been introduced by the South African government. More than 116 of these, or 37%, have been introduced or went through Parliament since 1994. And one of the speakers here today, Ernst van Zyl, it's thanks to his research that we know these statistics. AfriForum's stance is very clear. It's not complex. It's not academic. Our stance is simply that we are opposed to race-based policies and the racial classification system that the South African government still seems to cling, or not seems, definitely clings to. One of the key things to understand when it comes to policies like black economic empowerment is that it forms part of a collection of policies that, in just the title itself, sounds harmless, might even sound like a positive policy, but when you look at the policy's contents itself, what it looks like in practice, in reality, you start realizing that you judge a tree by its fruit. And this BEE is a tree that claims to be a fruit tree, but that doesn't really carry any fruit except the bitter fruit of discrimination and economic destruction and government cronyism. Black economic empowerment, therefore, is the perfect example of how the ANC government pushes through and justifies many of its destructive policies by giving it beautiful titles and giving it, loading it ideologically to make it sound harmless and justifiable. But when it comes to the practice itself, these types of policies are not only immoral, not only fail to reach the goals that they set out to achieve, but they don't even really do a lot of good. They just create a lot of destruction and through immoral means. AfriForum recently submitted comments to the Department of Employment and Labour strongly opposing the updated numerical race targets for every industry and province. This push for the escalation of race targets is just another example of how race-obsessed the South African government has become and has been for many decades. BEE's outcomes over the decades clearly prove that it has nothing to do with empowerment, except maybe the empowerment of cadres, but in that case you have to call it CEE, cadre economic empowerment. But what it really is nothing more than a smokescreen for small elite empowerment and cadre deployment. And this is not a theory, it's not something that is not based in reality. It is something that we all can see. You only need eyes that work. AfriForum stands on very solid ground when it comes to these types of policies. It's, again, not complex, it's quite simple. Racial discrimination by the government was wrong in the past and it's wrong in the present. But in our time, what we see is a lot of people being very vocally opposed and condemning of the racial discrimination by the government in the past, but then in the same breath, very passionately, they defend and justify racial discrimination by the government in the present, which shows that on AfriForum's side and all our allies in this fight, we're standing on solid, principled ground, while our opponents flip-flop as it suits them. Another thing to take into account in this regard is that the zeitgeist, or in Afrikaans you'd say the tydsgees, is shifting towards AfriForum's stance and our allies in this fight. That policies like black economic empowerment and other racially discriminatory policies, let's call it what it is, let's not use the flowery language of the government. Let's just call things as they are and then leave it to our opponents to justify these policies. They may, or try to attempt to justify these policies. For example, when you go into an interview or an argument and it's a debate about BEE, you're not debating whether black economic empowerment with small letters is good. You're talking about whether racial discrimination by the government is justifiable. That is the way that the debate should be framed. Cold, hard facts, not flowery political, ideological language. The government's racialism has infected almost every facet of South African society. And again, this is not something that you need an expert or an academic to tell you. We all can see it around us. It's everywhere, from corporate hiring practices to even elementary school sports. Dis-Chem Pharmacy Chain's internal memo that was leaked in 2022 that put a moratorium on the appointment and promotion of white people is the most striking recent example. Not that it's hard to find examples of the government's race obsession. And again, there's a critical element in that story as well, and that it's not Dis-Chem that just one day decided that they want to put these racial requirements into their hiring and promotion practices. They clearly state within this internal memo that it is under pressure from the government, threatening them with massive fines. Not little fines, fines so large that it threatens their very future prospects in regards to their business model. And this serves as damning evidence of how absurd and unjustifiable the ANC's race agenda is. Government-driven, racially discriminatory hiring practices, which are marketed as affirmative action, again, one of those terms that sound flowery but in practice is immoral and unjustifiable. These are sham solutions. They're not really solutions to real problems. They claim to be, or try to create the illusion that they are solving real problems, but they don't. The government's preoccupation with this race agenda, rather than fixing the real problems that South Africans face and experience every day, is a real problem. What needs to be fixed is a dysfunctional education system, where in 2024, scores of children still have to walk through rivers just to get to schools that still have pit toilets. The real problem is a government that continues to fail to solve the pressing issues that affect South Africans every day, and these pressing issues include South Africa being a world leader in unemployment levels, our abysmal education system, rampant crime, which we've all experienced or been a victim of in some form, corruption with no brakes, and rolling blackouts that started 17 years ago. You don't see when a government fails to solve a problem, or when a person, to make it more personal, when a person fails to solve a problem for 17 years, at some point you have to admit that person is unable to fix or solve that problem. The same government then dogmatically, and here's the point that I think is very important when it comes to, if you read AfriForum's comments that I referred to earlier, is that the same government then dogmatically pushes more extensive and intensified racial legislation as the solution to all of these problems, but in many cases it simply exacerbates these problems. And here's how. Just last week, it was reported that multi-billion, multinational company Shell is going to exit South Africa after clashing with a BEE partner, risking $73 million of investment and thousands of jobs in a country with an unemployment rate above 40%. Another recent example of how destructive and twisted the South African government's racialist policies are is the new racial mandates that the state wants to force on the property sector. The government recently informed tens of thousands of estate agents, property developers, administrators, landlords, direct property sellers, and more within the property industry that they have to meet the government's race criteria or stop operating. Become as race obsessed as us or close your doors is the message from the ANC. The rotten cherry on top of the government's race agenda is the fact that in 2023, neighboring Eswatini got Starlink. And it is being reported that Lesotho is going to get it in 2025, while South Africa still sits high and dry without the prospect of this service from Musk's Starlink, for the simple reason that Starlink does not meet the government's race criteria. Again, these policies are not about empowering the poor. They are about securing a slice of the pie for the government and the politically connected. These three recent examples that I just mentioned alone are enough to demonstrate how destructive BEE is in regards to destroying jobs, chasing away investment, and it also shows how dangerous these racially discriminatory BEE policies are in regards to robbing people in rural areas which are plagued by crimes such as farm murders of the chance to get a reliable internet connection with the assistance so that assistance can be dispatched. A critical aspect of AfriForum's written comments to the Department of Employment and Labour was the push that a deadline must be fixed for the termination of racially discriminatory legislation by the government. A government that fails to address the critical issues that faces the country, while at the same time using these crises such as crime, unemployment, and stagnant economic growth as justification for intensified racialized policies, creates a vicious cycle. And that vicious cycle can only be ended by either immediately ending racial discrimination or racially discriminatory policies, or that a fixed end date is given. Not that when we reach our goals of eliminating poverty, eliminating crime, or having 10%, 15% economic growth, only then will we stop with our racially discriminatory policies. When you put that type of price or that type of goal as the only way for these policies to stop, and you are the ANC government, that means that racially discriminatory policies will never end. These discriminatory policies, in turn, as I said earlier, only worsen these crises. It worsens the unemployment crisis through destroying jobs and chasing away investment. It contributes towards load shedding through the practice of hiring and firing engineers and other employees based on race rather than skills. It leaves citizens exposed to violent crime in rural South Africa because they can't get Starlink or the service of Starlink to get better communication, to get assistance. So this vicious cycle of government failure and discrimination is perpetuated ad infinitum, forever. Racially discriminatory policies aimed primarily at the white minority population in South Africa have pretty much become multi-generational, seeing as these policies were instituted over 2 decades ago. At this rate, my children will be discriminated against by the government, and at this rate, my grandchildren will be discriminated against by this government. South Africa cannot call itself a non-racial country if the government continues to push stricter racial laws. The South African government likely already qualifies as one of the most, if not the most, racialist regimes in the world. After more than 100 years of racially discriminatory policies by the government, I think it's time for an alternative route, an alternative solution. Because these racially discriminatory policies under the ANC's watch have been allowed to continue into the 21st century, and if the ANC have their way, they will continue into the 22nd century, and if the ANC stay in power. So it's time to abolish these abhorrent practices and to also escalate the conversation in regards to criticizing and showing their flaws and pointing out where these policies are failing. And that's why I've invited these two very expert guests today to this conference, Ernst van Zyl of the Free Market Foundation and Phumlani Majosi, an author, that have both been very vocal against these policies, but not just vocal as in typing on social media. They've done the work, they've done the research, they've done the publication, they've actually looked into why these policies fail, not just making a tweet saying these policies are bad. They've actually gone and seen and done the research and are here today to present their findings. So welcome Martin in Pumlani. Eerste aan die woord, and first will be Martin, and he will be telling us a bit more, giving a bit more depth in regards to these policies to add to the conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.